Aloha and welcome back to the garden. I'm Miss Amber and I'm excited for you to join me today. If you were with us last class, you might remember learning all about composting. Do you remember the 4 compost ingredients? Greens, browns, water, and air. Nice job. I thought we could start today's class by taking a look at our compost jar and see how it's doing. Let's take a look. At the very beginning, when we finished putting all of our different compost ingredients into our jar, you could still tell what everything was. You could see the apple core and the grass clippings and the dried leaves. But now if we look 1 week later, what do we notice? After just 1 week, we can see so much happening inside of our compost jar. Lots of little critters moving around and breaking down all of the compost material. And now, after 2.5 weeks, what do we notice about our compost jar? After 2.5 weeks, it's hard to tell what anything is anymore. It's all starting to turn brown and look more and more like soil. I wonder how long it will take until it's all broken down. How cool is it that we can take our food and yard waste and mix it all together and watch as the FBI breaks it down for us? Today we're going to be taking a closer look at all of those soil organisms or living things. And we're going to talk about the soil food web. So what is a food web? Well, it's the interconnected relationships between producers, consumers, and decomposers. Now, what does that all mean? Well, let's start by defining some of those words. So what are producers? Producers are organisms or living things that make their own food or energy using energy from the sun in a process called photosynthesis that we'll learn all about in a later lesson. Can you think of an organism that makes its own food using energy from the sun? Plants. So plants are our producers. So what are consumers? Consumers are organisms that consume or eat other living plants and animals. And there are different levels of consumers. The first level are primary consumers. And these organisms are herbivores, meaning they only eat plants. Secondary consumers are our second level, and these are organisms that get their energy by eating primary consumers. And so our secondary consumers can be carnivores, meaning they only eat other animals, or they can be omnivores, meaning they eat both animals and plants. Our tertiary consumers are our third level, and these organisms are carnivores that get their energy by eating other consumers. So our producers get their energy from the sun, and our consumers get their energy from eating other living things. And lastly, we have our decomposers, which you may remember from our composting lesson, get their energy from eating and breaking down organic matter, or things that were once alive and are now dead. Our decomposers return these nutrients from the living things back into the soil. So a food web shows the interconnected relationships between all of these different organisms. So who are the producers, consumers, and decomposers in our soil? So let's follow the flow of energy within the soil ecosystem to see what our soil food web looks like. So all energy in the food web starts with the sun. And we know that our producers are organisms that get their energy from the sun. And so what organisms live in the soil and get their energy from the sun? Plants. So plants are the producers in our soil food web. So when parts of these plants, like fallen leaves, drop down to the ground and are sitting on the soil, this plant material, or organic matter, gets eaten by our soil organisms. So what are the organisms in our soil that eat and break down this organic matter? The FBI, like we learned about in our last lesson. Do you remember what FBI stands for? Fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates. Some of this organic matter will be broken down by our decomposers, the fungus and the bacteria, but some of it will also be eaten by invertebrates like sow bugs, pill bugs, fruit flies, slugs, and snails. And these are our primary consumers because they eat the plant material. But remember, our consumers also include organisms that eat other animals or that eat both plants and animals. And so these secondary and tertiary consumers include things like centipedes, spiders, ants, earwigs, and ground beetles. And lastly, we have our decomposers. And these are the organisms that eat the dead and decaying plant and animal material. And these are going to be our organisms like worms and millipedes and fungus and bacteria. So let's build a soil food web with our soil producers, consumers, and decomposers. So what does every food web start with? The sun. And the sun provides energy to the plants or our producers. And the plants grow, and maybe some of that plant material falls onto the soil and starts to get eaten by our soil organisms. And so some of it starts to decompose with the fungus and the bacteria, but some of it gets eaten by our consumers, maybe a pill bug and a fruit fly, and then maybe that fruit fly gets caught in a spider's web and the spider eats it, and the pill bug gets eaten by a centipede, and maybe that centipede would also eat the spider. And so we can start to see our food web forming. And now that centipede maybe dies and gets broken down by our decomposers, our fungus and our bacteria and our worms. It gets broken down just like that plant material. Or maybe that centipede gets caught by a bird and the bird eats it and our food web continues outside of the soil. And so we can see how everything is connected and all of that energy and nutrients pass through the soil food web. Now, these groupings of animals based on where they are in the food web are called trophic levels. And these trophic levels can show us how energy flows through an ecosystem, from the sun to the plants to the animals. So remember how we talked about plants and they absorb their nutrients out of the soil? Well, when an animal eats that plant, they then absorb those nutrients from the plant. And this gets passed along from animal to animal until eventually that top animal dies and gets decomposed and returns those nutrients back into the soil. Do you see how it's all connected? All of these soil organisms are so important because without them, there would be nothing to break down all of the dead things in nature and return those nutrients back to the soil for the living plants to be able to grow. So I was able to find some of these organisms in our soil, and let's take a closer look at them. Remember, if you're catching any of these critters at home, please remember that they are living things, and so be gentle, don't hold on to them for very long, and remember to release them back where you found them. And remember to protect your hands by wearing gloves or using a trowel, and never pick up slugs, snails, or centipedes. Do you recognize this first invertebrate? This little critter eats old leaves and veggie scraps, making it a primary consumer in our soil food web. If it feels threatened, it rolls up into a ball to protect itself. It's a pill bug, or a roly-poly. This second invertebrate is related to the pill bug and eats plant material, so it's also a primary consumer. They may look similar, but this critter can't roll into a ball like a pill bug, but has protective plates on its back. It's a sow bug. I bet you've seen bigger versions of this little critter. They can get up to 3 inches long. This invertebrate eats dead and decaying plants, which makes it a decomposer. It's a millipede. They also roll themselves up for protection. This little invertebrate has shiny, tough wings, but spends more time in the moist, dark soil than flying around in the air. This critter is a predator and hunts other invertebrates like slugs and snails, making it a secondary consumer. It's a ground beetle. We see these invertebrates in a lot of places, especially at night. They like the dark and so burrow into the soil during the day and come out at night. You can see this one using its antenna to feel its way around. These critters aren't picky and will eat just about anything, plant or animal, making them a secondary consumer. You got it, it's a cockroach. All of these little critters are important to our soil and to our garden. I just think it's so amazing how much is happening underneath the ground. Who knew the soil was so alive? Mahalo for joining me in the garden today, and aloha. I'll see you next time.